Hello. I want to share something from Twitter that I've never shared anything from Twitter before, I don't think. This thread is like 35 tweets long, so I'm not going to screenshot and post each individual tweet as I read them, but I will link to the thread in the description box so you can follow along with the text there if you would like to. But I will be including screenshots from various other bits throughout this video, if that makes sense. So this thread is by a user called @TERF. Her name is Olivia. And she posted this on August 21st, 2020. She says, I recently was asked to participate in an interview by a teenage TRA, Amy, who helps run an Instagram page with approximately 20,000 followers. She was starting a series on her page where she interviewed people with controversial beliefs that their followers wanted to learn the truth about. Their followers voted for a TERF to be the first person interviewed and submitted questions for me to answer. I saw this as a way to dispel false notions about radical feminism, so I accepted, and I also recruited the help of @BVibes and @2003 Rap Video. We each spent a considerable amount of time painstakingly writing out our answers to these questions in a way that we felt this mostly teenage TRA audience would be receptive to. Amy was very respectful to us and labored over creating the graphic design for our interviews. Okay, so now I'm going to interrupt this thread and I'm going to go through the slides of the interview. Lots of great information about radical feminism. Okay, so the first panel, defining radical feminism as told by a radical feminist, Olivia. Radical feminism is not an ideology of hate. As you may know, TERF means trans exclusionary radical feminist. Before I address the trans exclusionary part, let's talk about radical feminist theory is. Radical feminist theory analyzes the structures of power which oppress the female sex. Its central tenet is that female people as a biological class are globally oppressed by male people as a biological class. Think about it. Underage girls in Florida now have to get parental permission before getting an abortion. Young girls in the UK and parts of Africa are subjected to female genital mutilation and femicide, killing of female fetuses and babies, is rampant in parts of India and more. Sex-based oppression truly is a global problem. Radical feminists believe that male power is constructed and maintained through institutional and cultural practices that aim to prop up male superiority through the reinforcement of female inferiority. That is why radical feminists are also anti-racist, anti-ableist, and usually anti-capitalist. However, we are not a monolith or a hive mind, and so the views of radical feminists may vary. This is just a generalized explanation of what radical feminism is. Now, are we trans exclusionary? No, we aren't, because we include anyone of the female sex who falls under the trans umbrella, for example, trans men or non-binary people, etc., in our feminism, since again, our feminism is for people of this female sex. Why, you might ask? Aren't they men? Yes, but they are also biologically female. Can't trans men who haven't medically transitioned get pregnant? What about a female baby killed in India that would have grown up to be a trans man? What about a young female teenager in the UK who identifies as a boy but is still subjected to female genital mutilation because of his family's cultural practices? I'll just clarify here that Olivia is saying that trans men are men and she is using he, him pronouns, but she does mean females. We believe that one such manifestation of the patriarchy is gender, which we believe to be a socially constructed hierarchy which functions to repress female autonomy and has no basis in biology. This is one of the biggest differences between radical feminism and the mainstream gender ideology going on right now. I will get into this more later. Radical feminists also critique all religions and their institutions and other practices that promote violence against female people, such as prostitution, we do support sex workers, pornography, and FGM. We believe that the subjugation of women is a social process that has no basis in biology or any other pretext, and thus can and should be challenged and dismantled. Radical feminism also recognizes that females from different oppressed groups experience a combination of oppressions. Class, race, and disability have systemic structural impacts on different women's lives in different toxic combinations. Sex-based oppression affects all biological females, regardless of whether or not they are now men. If they pass and have fully medically transitioned, they might not experience the same level of sex-based oppression as a cis woman. That's Olivia's word, not mine. But they still experience some. Now, you might be thinking, what about trans women? As I mentioned before, radical feminism is about ending the oppression of the female sex, not people who have a female gender identity, because otherwise we'd be excluding trans men. Therefore, our feminism is not meant to advocate for trans women, as trans women are not oppressed on the basis of their sex. I do acknowledge that passing trans women can face misdirected misogyny if they are truly perceived to be women. However, I feel it's important to note that the misogyny they face is not a result of their sex, because they are of the male sex. Remember how I said I believe that gender is an oppressive construct meant to repress women? Well, if you have a female gender identity and you alter your appearance to match your idea of a woman and society begins to perceive you as a woman, meaning you pass as a cis woman, you will naturally be subjected to all of the regressive aspects of gender, including gender roles, stereotypes, biased treatment, expectations, and preconceived notions that our patriarchal society assigns to people who appear to be of the female sex. For example, a passing trans woman might be catcalled in the street or assumed to be worse at math just because she is thought to be of the female sex. So while trans women may benefit from our efforts to deconstruct the patriarchy by dispelling negative stereotypes, they are not the primary benefactors of our feminism. That does not mean we think trans women don't exist or don't deserve rights or that transphobia doesn't exist. It's just not what we focus on. If you understand why all lives matter is racist, you should also understand why saying feminism is for everyone is sexist. I'd also like to clarify that I do not hate trans women or men. I do not want them to die or have anything bad happen to them. I do not deny their existence, and they don't upset me. There are bad apples in every group of people on earth, including radical feminists, but I believe that most trans women are good people who just feel happier or healthier living as women. Contrary to popular belief, we do support trans rights in regards to housing, jobs, healthcare, etc., because we see these as basic human rights. Radical feminism is not an ideology of hate, and that could not be farther from the truth. For that reason, a more accurate way to describe radical feminism is male sex exclusionary, because it's not that we are discriminating against anyone for being trans. We just don't include anyone of the male sex because they are not oppressed on the basis of their sex. That doesn't mean trans women or cis men can't be allies to radical feminism, and in fact, many trans women and cis men do support radical feminism. Our exclusion of males doesn't mean that we think males don't suffer under the patriarchy or that we think they live their lives free of oppression. In fact, radical feminists believe that the patriarchy hurts males as well as females. We just believe that the unique challenges each sex face, in this case the female sex, deserves its own movement. If you're having trouble understanding why, think about the Black Lives Matter movement. Do people who support Black Lives Matter think that other lives don't matter or that other types of racism don't exist? Of course not. They just believe that Black people are oppressed in society and that they deserve a specific focus on them to address those issues. In the same way, radical feminism specifically focuses on the oppression faced by people of the female sex. Now we get to the interview with a TERF, radical feminist Olivia. Keep in mind, these questions that Olivia is answering were submitted by the followers of this Instagram account who voted to see an interview with a TERF. There's around 20,000 followers of this account. They voted that they wanted an interview with a TERF, and then they submitted these questions. How or when did you get introduced to your current beliefs? Olivia says, I came across an essay written by a trans woman that was riddled with the most misogynistic ideas about being a woman that I had ever read. It had a lot of adult content, but essentially the person was describing the ideal woman as being this surgically modified, hypersexual character that I thought we as women wanted to escape. At the same time, I believed the born in the wrong body narrative, and I also believed that trans women felt like women. I remember feeling so confused. If that's what a woman was and how a woman felt, then what the heck was I? I don't identify with the patriarchal, misogynistic ideals that are expected of women. Reading that post led me to Googling trans women misogyny or trans women misogynistic stereotypes to see if anyone else had noticed this phenomenon. I was so surprised to find that there were a whole community of women who had not only noticed this, but was the only group of people talking about it and fighting against gender. As silly as it sounds, it genuinely felt like I woke up when I read what they had to say. Do you ever question your beliefs? Yes, I do question my beliefs. That's what got me to become a radical feminist in the first place. I used to be a trans rights activist until I started thinking more in depth about the misogynistic connotations of the idea that one can feel like a woman. However, I know you were asking specifically about my radical feminist beliefs. I also question those too. Quite a few TRAs have messaged me looking to engage in a debate with me, and they often send me lengthy arguments or explanations that they ask me to read and respond to. While I don't often have the time to do things like that, I enjoy the opportunity to examine what I think and my motivations behind it. It's led me to become more solidified in my commitment to radical feminism. However, I do sometimes question whether or not I'm really the monster that TRAs make radical feminists out to be. However, the fact that several TRAs have come to discuss my ideas with me and have admitted that they had no idea that radical feminism isn't actually all that bad is what reminds me that I'm not evil. People have just been misled. However, the constant threat of being doxxed, along with gruesome, often detailed threats of rape, violence, and murder is quite upsetting to read. It can also be really demoralizing to be bombarded with TRAs equating you and other radical feminists to Nazis, fascists, and child molesters. Why don't TERFs realize that what they're saying puts trans lives at risk? Radical feminists are often told that our gender-critical discussions put trans people at a greater risk of violence. How does that make sense? Which group of people, in almost every case, is killing trans people? Men. Do you really believe that the men killing trans people are well read in radical feminist theory? Do you really believe that the men capable of murdering another person because of their identity have any interest at all in what a fringe group of feminists have to say? I certainly don't think so. Moreover, is there any evidence at all that a trans person has ever been killed by a radical feminist? I haven't seen any instance of that, but if you have one, I'd be interested to hear about it. My point is that the idea that women should be silent on issues that directly affect us because transphobic men are violent is ridiculous. Women are not responsible for male violence, nor do we have any way to control it. If you have an issue with the violence against trans people, why not join us radical feminists in holding men responsible for it instead of attacking women for the actions of men? Why do you think AFAB, trans men, and non-binary people exist? Is that a betrayal of womanhood? I'd first like to address the concept of womanhood. I believe the only thing that all women have in common is shared biology and biological experiences, i.e. menses, pregnancy, menopause, etc., and currently a shared experience of sex-based oppression. To me, that is what womanhood is. Of course, some women have had health conditions that result in amenorrhea or infertility, and some women choose not to have children. That has no bearing on the fact that they are still women and experience womanhood. Therefore, AFAB, assigned female at birth, trans men, and non-binary people are just as much involved in my concept of womanhood as any other woman. To suggest that the fact that they have a gender identity in any way betrays womanhood suggests that you believe womanhood is based on regressive gender expectations assigned to the female sex, like femininity. Femininity is a harmful, misogynistic concept that causes extreme distress for those women who don't align with it, such as AFAB, trans men, and non-binary people. In fact, I believe that femininity and any other female gender role, expectation, or notion combined with sex-based oppression is part of the reason why AFAB, trans men, and non-binary people exist. Many detransitioned women and D-sisters have confirmed that these aspects of the patriarchy played a huge role in the reason they transitioned in the first place. If I was a young teenager during this era of gendered ideology, I know that without a doubt I would identify as non-binary. However, now that I'm older and I've learned about radical feminism, I have realized that 1, I cannot change my sex, and 2, I don't have to act, dress, or behave any type of way to be a woman, and that being of the female sex doesn't mean anything about who I am as a person. I am a woman and will always be a woman by virtue of being born as one. It's not a bad thing to be a woman. Some parts of life definitely suck because we are oppressed for being women, but I'm trying to fight against that. However, Oppressive gender roles, sex-based oppression are not the only reason AFAB, trans men, and non-binary people exist. Many of these people suffer severe dysphoria and transition for that reason. It is critical to acknowledge that, but I also feel it is critical to analyze the effects that gender ideology may have on young women who don't align with femininity. What are your thoughts on trans men? I think if they're genuinely happier living as men, that's great for them. I don't have any negative thoughts or feelings towards them. Most of my trans friends are trans men, and they've all been lovely people to have in my life. However, I still advocate for them in my feminism because no matter what they look like, they will still experience sex-based oppression because a female cannot completely identify out of sex-based oppression because sex is an immutable, inherent quality of a person. You cannot change your sex, and therefore you cannot identify into or out of sex-based oppression. Let's take a trans man for example. Let's assume that this trans man completely passes as a man, has had a hysterectomy, mastectomy, phalloplasty, etc., and lives and passes as a heterosexual man with a wife and children. From a societal perspective, he appears to be a man and is treated like a man. He's taken every step possible to rid himself of his female biology and embody the gender roles and expectations assigned to men. However, he is still subjected to sex-based oppression. How? Like I said before, women are oppressed on the basis of their sex, and this extends into all aspects of society, including science and medicine. Women continue to be and have been historically underrepresented in science and medicine. Until recently, clinical trials have not always adequately enrolled women or analyzed sex-specific differences in data. This underrepresentation has hindered the progress of understanding women's responses to medications. The medical field also doesn't have a great understanding of how disease processes differ between the sexes. For example, many women don't even realize that they're having a heart attack because the symptoms of a heart attack, most people know, are only usually experienced by men. That's part of the reason why acknowledging the biological differences in sex doesn't reduce women to just their reproductive organs, because it's not just our ovaries or uteri that are different. Every cell in our bodies is intrinsically female. Cross-sex hormones cannot change this. If our hypothetical trans man is ill or in need of medical attention, he will have to turn to a medical establishment that is entrenched in sexism and designed to cater to men. While he no longer has some of his female reproductive organs, every cell in his body is inherently female. He may have testosterone flowing through his veins, but he cannot escape the biochemical differences within his cells created by his XX chromosomes. However, he is and forever will be subject to sex-based oppression in the form of sexism in science and medicine. His body will not be as well understood by the medical establishment as a man's. The disparity in knowledge about differences in biology of women and men is rooted in sexism. Therefore, this trans man, despite his best possible efforts, will truly never escape sex-based oppression. For that reason, we still include and advocate for trans men in our feminism. Do you think people can identify as a gender that does not align with their sex, but still be a rad femme? Yes, I believe that females who identify as men can still be radical feminism. In fact, in my own little community online, there are several guys who are trans men but are radical feminists. They acknowledge that they are female and agree with our ideas. However, their dysphoria is so severe that it is more comfortable for them to present as men or refer to themselves as men. The vast majority of us are totally okay with that because we know they are still females affected by sex-based oppression. I guess. Yeah, I mean, that's technically true, but on a personal level, I don't think you can buy into the gender stuff and be a radical feminist. So I take a little bit of issue with that one. What are your main sources in debates revolving around trans individuals? It depends what specifically we are talking about. If we're debating neuroscience or biology, I use peer-reviewed articles from esteemed academic journals like Nature or Cell to make sure I'm providing accurate information. If we're discussing misogyny, I can use my own life experiences or can turn to government-collected statistical data. However, a lot of times my sources are simply my own common sense and experience as a woman. That's a good one. Give me a reason to be a TERF that's not transphobic. The following issues are ones that radical feminists believe ultimately hurt women and we work to address. If you're against the murder of female infants, you might be a radical feminist. If you're against female genital mutilation, you might be a radical feminist. If you're against sex trafficking, if you think that child marriage should be banned in the US and around the world, if you believe in speaking up for women around the world who are oppressed under patriarchal religious ideologies and cultures, if you support and include sex workers in your feminism but think that the vast majority of sex work exploits women and girls living in poverty in developing countries, if you think that BDSM culture grooms women and girls into accepting domestic and sexual violence, if you believe that beauty is a Eurocentric concept that harms women by causing eating disorders, body dysmorphia, and mental distress, etc., you might be a radical feminist. Why don't TERFs think trans women are women? So you may have noticed that in my other answers I said that trans men are men, and therefore I must also think that trans women are women. I used that language intentionally for the purposes of this discussion, but outside of this discussion I do not agree with the phrase trans women are women. Before anyone gets upset, please allow me to explain. The difference in language used by radical feminists and those who believe in gender ideology is often a huge point of contention. For simplicity's sake, I will refer to people who believe in gender ideology as trans rights activists, or TRAs. I'll first start with my understanding of the words and definitions that TRAs use. Woman, a person who has a female gender identity. Man, a person who has a male gender identity. These are the mainstream definitions of those words as defined by those who subscribe to gender ideology. I will define the words as radical feminists see them and use them. Woman, a biological female. A person of the female sex who lacks the SRY gene and thus generally develops a reproductive system based around the production of ova, female gametes. This includes intersex women. Man, biological male person, a person of the male sex who has the SRY gene and thus generally develops a reproductive system based around the production of spermatozoa, male gametes. This includes intersex men. These are scientifically supported definitions, so given that we use women to refer to people of the female sex, and the statement trans women are women is not true, because trans women are not of the female sex. Do we believe that they fit the female gender identity? Yes. So why don't we just use the words and definitions established by TRAs? Because we do not agree with gender ideology and are gender abolitionists. Why? Because gender is an oppressive social construct that assigns harmful gender roles, stereotypes, expectations, and notions to people of the female sex. Personally, do we believe that they fit the female gender identity? Yes. No. There is no female gender identity, so I don't agree with that, but whatever. Mermaids UK, a prominent and well-regarded transgender non-profit in the UK, defines gender as often expressed in terms of masculinity and femininity. Gender is largely culturally determined and is assumed from the sex assigned at birth. Well, what is femininity? According to the Gender Wiki, femininity is a set of behaviors, presentations, and roles which we are culturally associated with being a woman and or possessing female sex characteristics. People of any gender identity or sexual orientation can be feminine, but those who are assigned female at birth often experience societal pressure to be so. Femininity, which defines the female gender, is essentially the misogynistic, patriarchal ideal of how a woman is supposed to look and act like. It is one of the clearest manifestations of sexism in society. Here are some attributes that Gender Wiki associates with femininity: grace, delicacy, gentleness, deference, humble submission, passivity, a gender expression which includes dresses or skirts, long hair, and or makeup. Let's contrast that with the attributes that Gender Wiki associates with masculinity. Physical strength, power and confidence, bravery, stoicism and determination, assertiveness, aggression and social independence, mechanical instincts and a desire to solve problems, a gender expression which includes pants, short hair, and visible musculature. If you're reading this and you are a person of the female sex, I want you to ask yourself, do you agree that women are all passive, submissive, and gentle people? Do you lack a desire to solve problems and have independence? Do you genuinely identify with that and believe that other women identify with that? Do you believe it is masculine to not wear makeup or wear pants? Perhaps some women do, but we do not agree that women should be defined by a misogynistic idea of how a woman is supposed to act or look, aka femininity. The idea that anything defines or connects all women beyond our biology is inherently misogynistic, oppressive, and very offensive. Therefore, to support and agree with the idea of gender is to support and agree with our own oppression under the patriarchy. Therefore, radical feminists do not have a gender identity, so we are not cis. You might be thinking, well, not being cis doesn't automatically make you a trans man. It sounds like you could be gender fluid, non-binary, agender. I disagree. By choosing to subscribe to gender ideology and identifying as any gender identity, even agender, you are participating in and reinforcing gender ideology and thus agreeing with the idea that femininity truly does define women. You are agreeing that the vast majority of women identify with an extremely misogynistic idea of what it means to be a woman. That, folks, is called sexism. Once again, I do not believe that there is anything that defines women as a class of people outside of our shared biology. Therefore, if trans women are not of the female sex, and if there's nothing that defines women beyond our biology, unless you're a misogynist, what do I have in common with trans women? Nothing. So for the above reasons, I do not consider transgender women to be women or of the female sex. If you agree with gender ideology or think I'm transphobic for saying that, then you are a misogynist, whether you realize it or not. Disagreeing with gender ideology does not mean we deny that trans people exist or are real, want trans people to die, hate trans people, think trans people don't deserve human rights, are Nazis, right-wing, alt-right, or fascists, or are the walking incarnation of Satan. That is the interview. Great information. I would say I agree with 98% of it. I'd like to continue with the Twitter thread now. The reaction to this interview. So Olivia goes on to say, my interview was the first and only to be posted. After less than an hour of being on their page, the backlash was so severe that the other admins of the page made the decision to delete the post, and another admin immediately posted a brief apology. You can pause to read this apology. When Amy finished school, she posted a more comprehensive apology pictured here. She and the other admins, some of whom are trans men, mind you, are being bombarded with private messages scolding them for platforming a TERF and for triggering people's dysphoria. Again, you can pause now to read Amy's apology post. I foolishly only took one screenshot of the comments on the original post before it was deleted, which is this one. I knew this would make me dysphoric. She makes good points, but God, it's so unfair I wasn't born a cis guy. Why am I always going to have to be a female? Their acknowledgement of my good points suggests to me that this trans person did not detect any transphobia or arguments based in irrational hatred of trans people in what I wrote. Instead, their only gripe was with how it made them feel. By publicly commenting on how it triggered their dysphoria and made them feel bad, it signaled to the other TRAs that my interview was bad, harmful, and had to be taken down immediately, which, being dutiful TRAs, they did. Notice how they specifically mentioned what I said about every cell in a trans man's body being female, which is a scientific fact, as making them feel sick and cry. I didn't say, society will never consider trans men to be men. I said they're still biologically female. I can't help but seeing this as being dangerously unhealthy. This person's identity rests on a house of cards that requires constant validation to remain stable and collapses with one mention of biology. Truly, how will this person function outside of their safe space? I want to note that I do feel terrible that I triggered a teenager's dysphoria. That was not my intention. I simply answered the questions that were asked of me. A few commentators said there should have been a trigger warning, despite the fact that these were the opening slides. Looks pretty obvious as to what's going to be inside to me. There were plenty of comments on the apology post, most thanking the admins for swiftly removing my interview. Here are some examples. By the way, my social media was not linked to so the first commenter doesn't know who I follow. They're just making it up. You can pause to read these screenshots. Some of the commenters were even turning on Amy for conducting the interview and accusing her of being a TERF. Keep in mind, these kids voted to hear from a TERF, and they submitted the questions we answered. Yet somehow Amy is a TERF for doing what they wanted? This just shows how, under gender ideology, everyone is constantly on thin ice and under suspicion. It didn't matter that Amy hosted the page with trans people. It didn't matter that she executed the audience's wishes. The feelings of trans people were hurt, and so she must be a TERF. Here's another comment. I want to spend a little time breaking this down. They start by saying that Amy's apology doesn't seem genuine because one of the trans admins, not even Amy, reminded them that they specifically asked for the interview and submitted the questions. They say that even though they personally wanted to know TERF talking points, it shouldn't have been presented and defended in the manner it was. To suggest that my thoughts were defended by Amy is an egregious lie, considering she provided zero commentary on our interviews. Moreover, presented how? As an interview? As a series of questions and answers? Which is how it was originally advertised to her audience, and the majority of them enthusiastically voted for and no one complained about? Not only that, but this person complains that there was no trigger warning for any of it. As a reminder, 2 out of the 3 posts had TERF in big letters, front and center, and the other clearly stated it was about radical feminism. If that's not a trigger warning, I don't know what is. They go on to say that my interview made them extremely dysphoric and that had it just been an explanation of my beliefs and how I got them, it would have been fine. They then conflate gender and sex by falsely claiming I said that trans people would never be the gender they identify as. These kids take zero responsibility for their own actions. They asked for this, submitted the questions, willingly chose to read something they knew would upset them, found no transphobia, and still demanded that it be removed and attacked Amy because it made them feel bad. And, of course, it works. If a trans person's feelings are hurt, the world stops turning. Very few people call them on their bullshit, and the ones that do are silenced or fed some convoluted lie about why TERFs absolutely can't be heard. Just look at these examples. Pause to read. I suspect that these kids expected my interview to be a hot mess that they could all collectively laugh at and dismiss as a bunch of nonsense. Instead, they realized that the monstrous TERF had actually made good points that were grounded in science and reality. While this interview failed, this event has further solidified my opinion that gender ideology is a disease that's infecting young people and children and preventing them from developing critical thinking skills, among other things.